Thank you all. Thank you, Renee, for that wonderful introduction. And they say that there's like a home team advantage when you come back, but I feel super extra nervous because there's like 11 of my former professors in the room and my parents. and so I'm just hoping I don't swear too much. Well, no, thank you very much for coming out. I appreciate it. This is a fun little paper that I put together because I'm a big fan of Community. Have people seen Community? Woo! And I'm also a big fan of Doctor Who. Woo! And Community did a parody of Doctor Who in the first episode of this season for about 5 seconds. And the internet went wild. Evidently, we were not the only people that were fans of Community and Doctor Who. And so I started getting intrigued with this because I had been talking about fans and the internet, and here was something that seemed unique to fandom and unique to the internet. And so it's kind of, then when Renee asked for a talk, I'm like, wow, this is exactly what I was, like it kind of fell into my lap. So I'm really happy about that. So my talk is called Fan I Am, Hyperreal, Fandom, and Parody. Is the light too bright? Can you see is it too washed out?
It's a little washy.
Yeah,
whoa.
No, that's perfect. Because then I can perfect. Excellent. And this is a little dark, I'm sorry, but you can, if you feel the need, that's my Twitter handle, and you can feel free to tweet about this, as Twitter is one of the kind of technologies I'll be talking about. I'll also be talking about Tumblr, which is a kind of newish microblog service, and how Inspector Spacetime really grew and fostered on Tumblr. But I want to start the talk today by asking kind of what seems to be a simple question, but is actually a very difficult one, which is, what does it mean to be a fan? Right, a lot of my research has been concentrated in fandom. Fans are people that feel an emotional attachment to something, usually a media text, but you could be a fan of cheeseburgers. But in today's society, what does it mean to be a fan? What things does one have to do or be in order to be considered a fan? How do we make that determination between fan and just audience? And I want to ponder this question today through Inspector Spacetime, which I think is a key text in fan studies today, in the way that fans have emerged, in the way fans are using and developing their fandom online. Inspector Spacetime is kind of an interesting text because there is no text. It exists for a total of about 20 seconds, the actual text of Inspector Spacetime. And from that 20 seconds, fandom, the Inspector Spacetime fandom, have constructed a 50-year history of television. So I think Inspector Spacetime, and it's all done online, some offline, but mainly online. So I think Inspector Spacetime illustrates two things that I see as kind of the key components of 21st century media, and that is playfulness and parody. And to emphasize them, I make them a little bigger. I think these are two of the key characteristics of media today and fan identities today. So before I kind of get into this, I thought we could all, as fans together, explore Inspector Spacetime. So here is the complete extant text of Inspector Spacetime, which actually premiered in the 2011 episode called Biology 101 of Community. But in the show, the show Inspector Spacetime, the fictional show Inspector Spacetime, premiered in 1962.
Mind me, Inspector. Where have we wound up this time? The question isn't where, Constable, but when. Inspector, look out! Bullets! This is the best show I've ever seen in my entire life.
That was episode 1. That was all fans had. And then this is episode 4, I think.
Mind me! On the ground. Let's activate it and view the performance.
All right, that's it. That's all of Inspector Spacetime. Everything else about Inspector Spacetime that's been on Community has been Abed and Troy, as fans of Inspector Spacetime, performing their fandom. So actually, what we see in Community is a representation not of the show Inspector Spacetime, but of the fandom of Inspector Spacetime. And I think in a lot of ways, this has spurred the fanish audience of Inspector Spacetime to act out as fans, to be fans, because they see themselves represented on screen. As its existence, I think, demonstrates, Inspector Spacetime is what I'm calling a hyperreal parody, because there isn't an actual Inspector Spacetime, and in fact, it's not like we even have a fictional Inspector Spacetime to play with. But it's a very real fandom, and the fans have actually done quite a bit. This is the I use the Inspector Spacetime Tumblr, Inspector Spacetime Confessions quite a lot. Things are constantly being posted up there every day. There's 2 or 3 fan-produced texts that go up there. Fans have also made fan art. They've written fan fiction. They've made videos. There's, at a Doctor Who convention, there was an Inspector Spacetime panel, which actually talked about the kind of symbolic, metaphorical, and socio-political meaning of this show that has never existed. And just this person is not recognizable to anyone particularly, but his name is Tony Lee. He writes the Doctor Who comics at the moment. So people in Doctor Who are aware of Inspector Spacetime, and people in Community are aware of the Inspector Spacetime fandom. Fans have also made credit sequences. Credit sequences to Inspector Spacetime. So this is all fan created. Kind of stirring, right? I mean, this is good. They made music. It's pretty stirring and well done. So there we go. So on one hand, this is very obviously a parody of Doctor Who, but on the other hand, this is not about Doctor Who. This is about being fans, right? This is moving beyond what Henry Jenkins has called textual poaching, which is the taking of texts and changing them for your own enjoyment and for your own creativity. And it's even kind of moving beyond textual encroaching, because there's no text there to encroach upon. Everything the fans are doing is legitimate, because they're not really stepping on anyone's toes. There's no real transgression here. What I'm going to argue here is that it's kind of a textual reappropriation, taking the idea of this fan text and then saying, if they think that's what fans are, we're going to poach that. We're going to poach their idea of fandom itself. Inspector Spacetime, I think, exemplifies this wave of fandom because the Inspector Spacetime fans are parodying the act of being a fan. I want to argue that they are parodying spectator engagement. Because whether or not Inspector Spacetime is the creation of Dan Harmon and Community, or a parody, a very effective parody of Doctor Who, what fans are doing is parodying what fans do, which is make fan fiction, which is make fan videos, which is act things out at conventions. And it's showing a reverence, and in that act of parody, it is being parodic. It's showing both a reverence for the act of being a fan, and it's also kind of a critique of fan activity. It's also showing us this critique of consumption and production that fandom itself kind of articulates in all of its social media practice. So this and part of the Inspector Spacetime fandom has, and part of what we'll be talking about is dealing with this guy, who is Travis Ritchie, the actor who plays Inspector Spacetime.
The amazing Inspector Spacetime theme that was written by Brian Giovanni, who also did the themes for Robot Ninja Gaga and Smiley Town. I'll get that loopy too, that's really good. But I also made this intro video, and you can use the music for whatever you want. There's a link on that video to download the music yourself, so you can use it for whatever you want. If you want to create an intro, I'm sure a lot of you would do a much better job than I did the last time we talked.
Alright, so Travis Ritchie is a fan of Inspector Spacetime. He made the credit sequence we watched. He plays Inspector Spacetime. And in Travis Ritchie, we have this dual, kind of the representation of this dual tension of creativity and production, of consumption, and the articulation of a text. Because he may be a fan of Inspector Spacetime, but his paycheck also depends on Inspector Spacetime. He is both a fan and a producer. He is both the person creating Inspector Spacetime and the person creating fan work of Inspector Spacetime. So there's a real tension at the heart of Travis Ritchie, and using him as kind of an exemplar, I think we can really kind of explore the way this fandom has emerged, this Inspector Spacetime fandom has emerged, and how it has developed this critique of fan activities. Just to kind of give you a bit of a spoiler alert for what's going to happen at the end of the talk. Travis Ritchie started in February 20th. Ritchie started a Kickstarter account to fund an Inspector Spacetime web series, which he announced at a Doctor Who fan convention. So he was trying to raise $20,000 to make a web series of a fictional show that was on a different show. He, spoiler alert, within a month and a half, he raised $25,000 with 643 backers. What he posted on this Kickstarter kind of illustrates this tension, I think. He identifies himself as a producer. After my first scene of Inspector Spacetime was shot for Community, I am part of this. I saw the potential for the character. And then, at the end of that paragraph, I have to do it myself, strike that. We have to do it, ourselves, the fans. So he's identifying himself as a fan and a producer. He distances himself from NBC, Sony, and Community because he doesn't want to get into legal trouble, but of course he did. And so, lawyers for Sony and NBC ixnayed his production and said that he could not make an Inspector Spacetime web series. So he took Inspector Spacetime out of the web series, which is currently titled Untitled Web Series About a Space Traveler Who Can Also Travel Through Time. Which is going to be a Travis Ritchie production of an original production that has nothing to do with Inspector Spacetime. And he still managed to raise the $25,000. So there's obviously something going on here. There's obviously, I mean, if fans are doing more than just making fan fiction, making fan videos, but actually putting money. People have donated over $1,000 individually to this production. There's obviously something going on. And this is kind of a weird moment for fandom. Studies of fans in the past, and this is my lit review section, so feel free to tune out for a minute. Studies of fans have kind of looked at Star Trek, have looked at X-Files, Buffy, Supernatural, Babylon 5, even Doctor Who fans have been analyzed for 20 years now. And it's not to say that one particular fandom can't bleed into others, but as fan scholars, we have tended to look at the text as a unifying mode of identifying fans, inherently privileging a text-centric model of reception studies, which is paradoxical because reception studies should really study reception. So I think Inspector Spacetime, and what I want to do is turn this into a fan-centric model of scholarship. Just like Roland Barthes here, who uses the term myth to talk about how cultural practices can be imbued with meaning, things like watching wrestling, writing, and photography. I think that being a fan is today one of those myths. Being a fan today is something that has symbolic meaning. Fans have become, if you look at Jenkins' work, Henry Jenkins' work, fans have become a major contributor to the media environment. Fans are being courted by media producers. They're being the subjects of films, often kind of making fun of them a little bit. I think Fanboys is not particularly a nice portrayal of fans. But some of them are I think Galaxy Quest does a great job of showing us the power of fans to make meanings. And even things on like DVD extras for Firefly or Family Guy or Arrested Development, we learn about how fans kept the show alive, how fans encouraged viewership, brought the show back. And this is the first time that fans have really been seen in this kind of positive light. If you go back into the 80s, we get Jenkins writing about the Get a Life sketch from Saturday Night Live, where William Shatner famously tells the fans to get a life. And fans are very much looked down upon. But I think today the tide seems to be turning a bit. Fans are becoming an important audience. Hence why Community is making this sort of production. Fans, of course, represent the coming together of production and consumption because they make things as they also consume them. So here's my other really flashy animation. Into something, that's right, I know how to use PowerPoint. Into something that Axel Bruns calls producage, which is the most awkward term ever. But what it means is that you use things as you produce them and you produce things as you use them. And we all do this every time we read something, whether it's Harry Potter or The Secret Garden. We create meanings as we read. We transgress against the text, right? We read things that may not have been put there deliberately, and we read into things, and that's our right as a reader. And fans have been doing this, like I said, fans have been doing this since the beginning of fandom, since the beginning of television. Doctor Who fans have been particularly studied, especially in England. And Inspector Spacetime is a parody of Doctor Who, uses a lot of that same material as parody, uses a lot of that same material as an emphasis. Excuse me. So what do fans do? What have fans done? As one fan of Inspector Spacetime has put it, it's a very large-scale operation. There are writers, there are stagers and artists all working together, all functioning online together, communicating with each other to create a body of work that doesn't actually exist. This is a screenshot from the archive of the Inspector Spacetime Tumblr, and you can see that all of these different images are being created. They're all, and we'll show you some of them bigger so you can actually read them. But you see a lot of the images being created referencing Inspector Spacetime. There's some that put Doctor Who as kind of subservient to Inspector Spacetime. Here we have the Inspector writing the Doctor, meet me in 20 meters, could be dangerous. They all kind of feature the same, they all feature the booth, they call it the booth in Inspector Spacetime, renamed from the Darset, which was, we can talk about that if you'd like, but there was some confusion in the fandom for a while. They reference Community, of course. Here's an Inspector Spacetime convention that they are. And of course, there's also a fight back against Doctor Who, or from Doctor Who fans. But what's interesting is not just that they're producing these kind of humorous little images on didn't even say little, but these humorous images on Tumblr, but there's actually a lot of backstory going into this as well. TV Tropes. Are we familiar with the website TV Tropes?
Yeah.
TV Tropes was really the first place Inspector Spacetime information started being collected, and it happened almost immediately after that episode of Community, that Biology 101 episode. So online, on tvtropes.org, there is a whole history of Inspector Spacetime. And that, like I said, happened, I think, that either that night or the day after that episode premiered. And like a wiki, it just keeps getting built and built and built as fans build up this history. There was also fan fiction. This blog came out, I think, a week after, or maybe it was less than a week after that, that one 10-second clip came out, where someone wrote a blog fan fiction about Inspector Spacetime. And actually, from the fan fiction came a lot of the characteristics of Inspector Spacetime that later became canonized, if you will, even though it's not really canon because there isn't really a show. And to kind of help collate all this, there was an Inspector Spacetime message board online, Inspector Spacetime Pro boards. I took this today at lunch, and the last post was March 26th, so it's still an active board. People are still posting things up on this message board. Some of the things that they're doing on here, you can see they're planning, like, discussing the canon of the show. Here's what happened in Inspector Spacetime, talking about it, and then cataloging the fan stuff that's out there. So they themselves are separating out the production and the consumption, the text and the fandom, the canon and what's called fanon, or fan work. They discuss villains. The episode that you saw had the Blorgons in it. And they're discussing whether or not they, which villains you like, the classic Blorgons, which they misspelled, or the scary circuit chaps, which were never in that episode, but are being brought from Doctor Who. The Sergeant, which is a parody of The Master, if you are familiar with Doctor Who. This is on the TV Tropes page. You get a lot of them cataloging all the episodes and characteristics of all of the different inspectors that existed. In addition, there's a behind-the-scenes dialogue. September 24th, the episode premiered on September 23rd. So September 24th, TV Tropes had come out with this thing. Sprecha was the guy that started it. Came out with this page, and this dialogue comes up, and they're even self-aware. Take a moment to think about this. We've made a 20-second gag into an entire universe. And then they immediately start work on an episode guide. Episode by episode. This is still going on up till today. This was posted today after the episode of Community last night. Did you see the episode of Community last night? Awesome. It was very Inspector Spacetime centric. Where there was an issue, where Abed had given a name to something in the Inspector Spacetime universe that contradicted the fandom, and here they have to deal with it. Abed's Inspector Spacetime adventure in the Dreamatorium has some pieces of information that seem canonically sound, while others that may be his own version of fan fiction. Do people think about ways to incorporate all of this into the TV tropes page? So this is an ongoing dialogue where they're still kind of dealing with Inspector Spacetime and much of the Inspector Spacetime, the original Inspector Spacetime material, revolved around some images. So this is one of the first images that came out for Inspector Spacetime. The two other kind of canonical images of Inspector Spacetime were these, which were made by fans and posted to LiveJournal. People still use LiveJournal. And to illustrate the popularity of the show. And in turn, Community, we'll be getting back to this picture later in the talk, so keep that one in your mind. Community itself is aware of Inspector Spacetime, as Troy and Abed are participating in their own fandom. So this is Troy and Abed's apartment, and in the background you can see an Inspector Spacetime poster. There's another Inspector Spacetime poster. There's another one. Abed is Batman, and there's an Inspector Spacetime poster. All these different posters, all these different fan works being portrayed on the show. Being taken, this fan activity being taken and reappropriated. The fandom is being poached by the production, by Community itself. So we were talking about Travis Ritchie, and I think this is a good time to talk about the paradox that he represents, or that dichotomy between production and consumption. Because he started participating in the fandom from the get-go. This is September 30th, a week after his episode premiered, and he says, and he posts on the pro boards, the message boards. Everyone, like, I'm a fan of both these shows. I'm happy to play a role in it. This is great, and he really starts to become involved in this production. He gives a lot of behind-the-scenes description. He gives a lot of discussion about, is this the right term, is that the right term, what term should we be using on Community and in Inspector Spacetime. But not everyone is happy about the intrusion of a producer coming into the fandom and appropriating fan work, in a reversal of how media corporations like Warner Brothers are particularly angry with fans reappropriating their material. So here we have someone, oh, I'm sorry, I skipped ahead a slide. Oh, dear, I'm so sorry. But we'll get to that slide in a minute, sorry. This is more Ritchie, this is more Travis Ritchie, loving that the form exists, and talking about, he even starts mentioning the spin-off here, but he does start correcting fan work. He says, I want to say a quick note on the subject of writing a good spoof. So kind of putting his own authorial stamp on here. On the flip side, tools like Sonic Wrench or Sonic Phillips Head sound like gags. We want to poke fun at Do Everything tools, so why not something more like a Swiss Army knife? I want to ask why. Have a reason for doing things. And even later he says that he likes the phone booth thing, but why is this word different than that word? So he's kind of correcting the fans in this instance. Later he corrects the spelling of blowgons to blorgons, and mentions that anything that Community does would be obviously supersede fan work. So even though he's trying to be this fan that sits in this area, he is also trying to play the role of producer and kind of control the discussion. Later he gets even more particular about this. They were calling the phone booth, the traveling booth, the Darset for a while, which is just TARDIS, kind of letters reversed. And he says, why don't we name it the Civartis, which is his Twitter handle. So there's kind of a little bit of interplay going on with him wanting to be more involved in the fandom and kind of directing the fandom and going in one particular direction. Later, October 19th, he is asking questions about this because he's like, who's posting this? This doesn't make a lot of sense. I'm not quite sure how this is fitting into the canon.
I won't bother introducing myself. I am the Inspector. You may call me the Inspector. And it is my great pleasure to say a hearty hello to you here at Chicago TARDIS 2011. That's what it's called. The Chicago TARDIS. What, not the Great Associate Assembly or the Convergence of Infinity Night Fanatics?
So he's promoting the panel, the Doctor Who convention that I mentioned earlier. He's promoting that, and no one asked him to. He just said, there's going to be an Inspector Spacetime panel, I'm going to participate. And so in some ways he is a fan. In some ways he is kind of contributing to the fandom, but in other ways he's kind of controlling it. He signs fan art too. So you can send him your poster, and for a small fee he'll sign it for you. Like I was saying, not everyone is super thrilled with what Richie is doing. This was a post that came up about a month ago, which, and I don't know who's posted this. It's all kind of anonymous or pseudonymous. Is that a word? It's a pseudonym. And Travis Ritchie is a self-important, self-inflated con man. He's using the actual people who made the canon for Inspector Spacetime for his own personal gain. The first episode of his web series is simply a Doctor Who show with the serial numbers filed off. He thinks he can just take other people's money for himself while claiming it's for them. So there is an idea in the fandom that Richie is somehow coming in and appropriating the fan work and taking the fandom in a direction that the fandom doesn't want to go. Which is ironic given how fans have been treated in the past, which is that that's exactly how they've been treated. That they take work in places that it shouldn't go. So there's a really interesting tension there. Since Inspector Spacetime fans are so linked to Doctor Who fans in a lot of ways, it kind of makes sense to look at the history of Doctor Who fans as a counterpoint to Inspector Spacetime fans. Doctor Who's been studied, obviously Doctor Who fans have been studied in the past, and John Tullett calls them the powerless elite, and this is in the age before the internet, or rather before the web. The powerless elite, they had no power to actually do anything involved with the show, but they knew more about the show than the producers themselves. Right? So fans of Doctor Who he was writing in 85, this book came out in 85, so fans of Doctor Who in 85 were so knowledgeable they knew more than the people that were involved, but that knowledge had no relevance, no power, right? Today, I think Inspector Spacetime fans are kind of powerful non-elites. In a reverse of what Tullett is talking about. They have an amazing amount of power to create Inspector Spacetime, but no one cares because it's not a show. It does not making money. It's not out to promote anything. It's just for their own benefit, for their own fun. So it's not that they are powerless elite or powerful elite. They are kind of incredibly powerful, but with no real direction to take that power in, and that's why they're kind of directing it at Richie in that sense. So I said we talk about this image. I think this is also pretty interesting because if we're planning on pinning a revolutionary label to Inspector Spacetime fans, I think we should be cautious about that because I don't think they're really that revolutionary. They're just doing what fans do and reversing that. They may be reversing that consumption-production dichotomy, but they're still participating in that dichotomy. They're still participating in that binary. This image is particularly interesting now in how it's such a direct reflection of Doctor Who and also a critique of Doctor Who. For those of you that know Doctor Who, you know there are 11 doctors and they all are straight white men. And here we have 11 inspectors, and there's an African-American inspector, there's 2 gay inspectors, there's Stephen Fry and Graham Chapman. There's a female inspector, there's an American inspector. Opening up the Inspector Spacetime canon to kind of more heterogeneous faces in that way, kind of opening it up. And so taking the Doctor Who, if they are parodying Doctor Who, there's certainly a reverence for it, but there's also kind of a critique of Doctor Who going on here. So, if we are talking about parody, it's tough to find a picture of parody, but if we are talking about parody, it brings up an interesting discussion, because philosophers like Jameson have asserted that we are no longer in an age of parody, that parody has lost its bite. I just got it. That parody parody has moved into pastiche, right? Or what he says, and this is my favorite quote, an imitation of peculiar or unique idiosyncratic style, the wearing of a linguistic mask, a neutral practice, amputated of the satiric impulse. Pastiche is just parody without bite, with no purpose, with just repeating things for the sake of repeating them. And I think in some ways Inspector Spacetime is very much like pastiche. Inspector Spacetime is very much the cannibalization of all the styles of the past, taking styles of Doctor Who, taking styles of Community, taking all these styles with random allusions thrown in there. But I think in another way it's also very parodic. I think it is also a way of parodying popular culture, of parodying fandom. Parody has bite, parody has a point. And as the image of the 11 Inspectors shows, and as the way that they deal with Travis Ritchie shows, there is a real bite to what they're doing. There is a real attempt to break these kind of textual boundaries and exceed the boundaries of the genre. Indeed, because parody works because it both supports and subverts the system of which it's part. Parody works because you have to follow the boundaries of the text if you're going to parody it, if it has to be recognizable, but you have to break those boundaries as well if you're going to be making fun of it. So, in all the parodies that Inspector Spacetime does, parody of Doctor Who and parody of fandom, it's both showing you these boundaries, showing you where these boundaries lie, but also breaking them, also showing us what lies beyond that binary, what lies beyond that boundary. It's kind of the ultimate meta moment for fandoms, where they can say, we are fans, and this is what fandom is, and here's where fandom falls short. Here's what fandom can't do. And so perhaps that dichotomy, that confluence, is what's most spectacular about Inspector Spacetime. It is both parody and pastiche. It's both reverent for the Doctor Who text and the Community text and the Inspector Spacetime text, but also critiquing those texts at the same time. It's a simulation of fandom, but it's also a practice with no kind of discernible intent. It is, in a way, and maybe this is putting too fine a point on it, it's a way of thinking around the theoretical binaries of production and consumption and fandom and creation that have kind of defined the cynicism of late 20th century media studies. It's kind of taking Jameson and saying, no, hold on. There is something important going on here with the act of parody, with the act of pastiche at the same time. This is a cosplayer at the Chicago TARDIS Convention 2011 who was dressed up like Inspector Spacetime. He is a fan of being a fan. He's dressed up as someone being a fan. Even though he's wearing the clothes of the Inspector, he is portraying fandom. This is an act that kind of defies typical characterization. Community went on hiatus from November until March. And this was the last shot of Community before it went on hiatus. And you can see your 7 main cast members all huddled around. They're watching Inspector Spacetime here. But as a very important cast member of the show, there's Inspector Spacetime in the background, nicely framed by the characters. As of March 23rd, Inspector Spacetime had become part of the show, had become a character in the show itself. And at that same time, Travis Ritchie had made his minimum goal of $20,000 for his web series. Excuse me, that was really loud. The implication is, of course, that Inspector Spacetime remains a fan text on Community, but is also morphing into something produced, something different, something canonized through Travis Ritchie's work. The implication here is, of course, that Inspector Spacetime is becoming, Inspector Spacetime fandom is itself becoming a key participant in Ritchie's work. Without Inspector Spacetime fans, he would not get that funded. And without Inspector Spacetime fans, Community, they're recognizing the work of fans to keep Community on the air. Since, Community is having a lot of trouble staying on the air, despite this room, which seems to be quite a big fan of Community. So get out there and spread the word. I wrote a book about fans called Digital Fandom, and I ended it with talking about how there's a philosophy of playfulness with today's media audiences. They just like to play. And I think that Inspector Spacetime, I wish it had been out when I was writing this book, because it would have been the cornerstone example. This is play. This is fun. This is just what they do. And when a producer comes in and tells them, I'm going to make a web series about this, when Community or NBC starts selling Inspector Spacetime shirts, which they started doing last week, the fandom suddenly becomes different. It suddenly becomes less about playing and becomes more about asserting an identity. And in fact, even I have become part of the Inspector Spacetime fandom. This was posted to the Inspector Spacetime Tumblr last week, or March 27th, a couple weeks ago, and has 43 tags. People are really interested about it. Is anyone here who saw this?
I reblogged it and freaked out so hard.
Oh, awesome.
I was like, oh my god, that's my
Awesome. So they're real people. They're real people. Right? Ultimately, Inspector Spacetime is a kind of a holding pattern, right? Because Community, we're not quite sure if Community is going to have a 4th season. We're not quite sure what's happening with the Untitled web series about a space traveler who can also travel through time. We're not quite sure where Inspector Spacetime is going to go. As of the episode of Community last night, we still haven't seen any more actual Inspector Spacetime. We've only ever seen fan work depicted of Inspector Spacetime on the show. But regardless of what happens to Inspector Spacetime, this has been a unique moment in the history of fandom, where fans have created the text that they themselves have become a fan of, which, if nothing else, means it can never jump the shark. Which is Thank you very much. These are my... Awesome. These are my lovely dogs. Feel free to get in contact with me if during the Q&A any of your questions aren't covered or answered. Open it up to questions. Stephen.
What are the political implications of this emergent culture as top-down versus bottom-up government, politics, culture, and the like?
Well, it's a good thing you left 20 minutes for questions. What are the political implications of this? Well, I think any sort of group of people that can create what amounts to being a 50-year history of a show has a desire and a drive to do things, to be productive. They're going and harnessing the kind of the collaborative potential of groups. They're finding like-minded people online. Yes, right now it's directed at what amounts to being kind of a silly thing, right? And I think they would recognize it's a silly thing. I mean, it's not life-changing. It's not going to change the world. But it's important, and the actions that they're doing are important. And if you can translate those actions, that kind of ground-up creativity, the meeting of, the coming together of different people, finding each other, working for a common goal, I think it could be used and directed towards some sort of political end. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think the implication is there's an audience that is willing to work and willing to do things. And the technology is there for them to do that. Maybe what they need is something to group around that they feel strongly about. Laura.
Paul, it seems to me that this kind of thing has happened before, where fans have created something and then production companies have said, oh, I did, woo, good idea, I think I'll produce that. But it seems to me that there are significant implications for our understanding of authorship and how authorship is defined. And I wonder if you'd like to talk a little bit about what, you know, what is this saying about who owns a text now, and copyright law, and the protectionism of intellectual property as we understand those laws in this country. What are the implications with this kind of rupture of the text?
Well, that's an excellent question and a good point. I think that there are some major questions of authorship going on. Dan Harmon, who is the creative community and who may or may not have had a huge amount to do with the Inspector Spacetime thing, has been pretty cool about fans doing Inspector Spacetime stuff. And he has not had much of a problem with the fans are selling t-shirts, and there hasn't been anyone who's complained about that. I think because it's remaining pretty small, right? It's not like everyone is wearing Inspector Spacetime shirts. And because it is a way of promoting community, which right now, suffering the ratings, so any reason for people to watch it is a good reason. When Richie started making, or announced his web series, and started raising real money, $20,000, that's when the corporation stepped in. I mean, it wasn't Dan Harmon that said, don't do this. It was Sony that came in and said, don't do this. So I think the big media corporations are still trying to deal with the fact that fans are their most devoted audience, but also subvert the text and quote unquote steal it, poach it, and different media corporations have different styles of dealing with it. Warner Brothers has said Harry Potter fan fiction is okay as long as it's not sexy. George Lucas says Star Wars fan fiction is fine as long as it's not sexy, and as long as I can put it in my own space, like they create space for it. So in kind of in the larger sense, I think that there's still this big tension going on in terms of what fans do and whether or not fans are allowed to. An aspect of this that I had to cut out of the talk because of time was comparing this to the Carnivalesque, and the idea that in the Carnivalesque, an authority gives you a space in which you can do anything you want for an X amount of time period, and you're not going to be held liable for it as long as the rest of the time you remain under our authority. And in some ways, Inspector Spacetime is that. Is they've been given a little section where as long as you're doing your fan stuff on these couple of sites, we're not going to care about it. But don't step out of bounds, and don't go over here, because then we will start caring.
And don't make money.
And don't make money. But I don't think fans want to make a huge. I mean, obviously they want to make money, but they don't necessarily want to make money off of this. This is what they do for fun. You know, it's not something that they want to do as a career. So.
Let me just follow that, because this is good. So I want to talk about Bart, because Bart's, but not the mythologist thing. I want to talk about death of the author, because this sort of classic early postmodern, late modern term that Bart puts in place is the whole notion of the death of the author, or the arrival of the reader. And it seems that this is an example not of the death of the author, but death of the text. That this is Bart one step further. That after the death of the author, we were left with text. And that's how when the poaching could occur, because the author was no longer the authority figure, and you could appropriate and reuse, remix, whatever you wanted to do. But in this case, the author is not only absent, but the text is absent.
Yeah.
And so the text fills the sort of classic psychoanalytical position of desire. So now I'll throw Zizek in the mix too, because what the fans are doing is they're trying to fill the gap, the absence of the text, by manufacturing what's not there. So there's this desire on the part of the fan, and that desire is bred specifically by the lack of there ever being the text. It's withdrawal.
And that's a very fanish. I mean, that's what fan fiction does. Even if there is a text, is filling in the gaps of the narrative.
Right.
Matt Hills talks about the hyperdiegesis, where you have more text than you know what to do with, and you just don't see all of it. And so you have a beginning, and you have a middle and an end, but what happened in between the middle and the end. And so fans come in and fill in those gaps.
And this is like to the limit of gap. I mean, it's almost all gap, right?
This is all gap.
You got 30 seconds, so it's almost all gap.
Yeah, yeah, and in that sense, I think that is the position that fans are in. I think that's a good way of looking at it, the depth of the text.
You can use that. I don't know.
Can I use that? No, but I think that just taking that even further in the idea that it's not just the depth of the text, it's almost the rebirth as well, and that fans have to resurrect this text. They have to have something to play with. And so what ends up happening is that I mentioned kind of the blog post and those Tumblr images and the TV tropes. That fan work has become the canon which other fans use for fan fiction. So that blog post that I put up there that came out the first week that Inspector Spacetime had existed, has been referenced by other fans making fan fiction and saying, this happens in between when that blog happened and what we saw on that show. So the fan work is actually becoming canonized as Inspector Spacetime work. And then there's fan fiction based on that. So there is almost like they're developing a text as well as killing off other texts. So that might make sense. Yeah.
But would it be the case from like the perspective of capitalism, if Sony is letting them go ahead, Sony is still making money later because they may be the ones selling all of the technology, you know, probably not. I mean, most real technical people like the Apples and the Macs, but selling the technology or advertising on the technology that is swirling through these fan areas. I mean, I bought a tumbler with something you drink out of, you know, silly me. You know, so.
Yeah, I mean, and I think when you're dealing with media corporations that have so many different arms
Exactly.
and so many different businesses, it's kind of a win-win whatever happens for them, and a lose-lose for the consumer in that kind of very Marxian sense.
Because if they're smart, they'll be looking ahead and hiring young people who have the social media savvy and are telling them this is going on, and then their financial people are making sure they're going to invest. So they may be losing on one production end, but they're making it in another.
Yeah, yeah, and that is the issue with copyright at the moment, I think.
Yeah.
The issue with copyright is there's nothing here, there's nothing that's been stolen in that sense. It's not like I've taken your camera and you don't have it anymore. It's that they've taken images of Inspector Spacetime that never existed in the first place and are playing with them. And Sony hasn't lost anything in that. In fact, if anything, they've gained viewers. So it is kind of a 20th century mentality of analog textuality in kind of this digital environment. So, and I think there is a shift. Some corporations are better than others at dealing with fans and copyright. Some people are still very draconian. George R.R. Martin, who did the Game of Thrones series, any fan fiction, he just rips it out. He says, he writes it, cease and desist letters. He's not allowed to play in his world. And he says, make your own world and play in it. He's not against creativity, but he doesn't want creativity in what he's done. And in a lot of respects, like, I respect that as that's his world, it's his creation, he wants to do that. But in another sense, it's kind of like, man, it's just someone who wants to like have fun with your stuff, you know, like, and it's no skin off your back. So I think media corporations are still stuck in that mentality without being able to embrace
You're not
it.
seeing the compliment in the fact that people want to embrace that.
But it's also ironic because fans spend 80% of the money on buying T-shirts and DVDs and all that stuff, even though they're only about 20% of the population that watches these shows. So to alienate the people that are spending the most money on your stuff seems counterintuitive to me. And I think if you look at the movies I show, Trekkies and Galaxy Quest and Fanboys, that's working through some of these issues where we want to depict fans, we want to show you fans, we want to be respectful, but there's always kind of an edge of, yeah, but they're just kind of not normal. You know, they're still a little bit weird. And that's that way kind of turning the identity around.
And be sure to ask Burns later about when he went to the Peter Wilson Nikita fan conference, because it was nothing like these fans. It was like housewife fan conference. And they went for the Love Boat. I mean, it was completely different, so, yeah.
Yeah, and that's the other thing, is this is one particular fandom at one particular moment, and different fandoms have all sorts of different identities. I don't think he would find Supernatural fans doing something like this, for instance.
It'd be interesting to do a cross-section of fans of various media, like a musician versus a television series and this, and how those play out over time.
Yeah, very much.
It's fascinating.
Well, you raised a good point about the Supernatural, because I think they did do an episode that sort of parodied itself, and something like this didn't happen. Do you think there's something unique or unusual about the intersection of community and Doctor Who fans that led to this particular explosion?
I don't know. That's a really good question. I think community fans, if someone who has stuck with Community for all 3 years, has to have a certain sense of humor. Because it's a kind of bizarre comedy that not everyone is going to like. It's kind of a niche identity. So I think there is that's, I don't want to generalize too much about community audience, which is much larger than Inspector Spacetime fandom. But I think there is maybe a certain humor in community fans, and you certainly see a lot of that humor in Inspector Spacetime. A lot of the scenes into this, and some of them are probably not going to be into that. So I'd say this is much more heavily, even though it's using Doctor Who as one of the parodies, I'd say they're much more heavily community fans as opposed to Doctor Who fans. Yeah.
This goes back to the one slide that you showed at the Doctor Who convention, I think it was. Mm-hmm. If there's no text, and I don't know if you knew what those two people were going to talk about on that stage for an hour.
I didn't. I went to the panel thinking they were going to talk about Inspector Spacetime Fandom, and I was like, damn it, that's my talk. You know, I was kind of like sitting there taking notes, like, how am I going to like use this? And it actually ended up being great for what I was planning on talking about, because here they were talking about Inspector Spacetime as if it existed, creating the text. Right?
So their criticism is examining the fan fiction, or their criticism is examining...
They took what had been created on the TV tropes page as canon, as fact, and said, there was a PowerPoint slideshow that Tony Lee went through that said, this is the first Inspector. He was the Inspector from 1962 to 1964. These were his companions. This is what he did. And during that time, they were dealing with issues in Britain of immigration and this, and that's why these. I mean, like, it was a very detailed reading of Inspector Spacetime, which was like Doctor Who, but unlike Doctor Who in a lot of ways too, because each one of the actors is themselves famous for something else, for either except for Travis Ritchie, is famous for as an old like Graham Chapman, Stephen Fry, these kind of well-known names. Placing their oeuvre into Inspector Spacetime. Stephen Fry had to take a pay cut to do this because he was working on Jeeves and Wooster at the time. But he was such a fan of the show that, and that stuff. Yeah.
Well, there's something that's very familiar, and I'm sure you probably are aware of it. It seems like it took on the same kind of thing, and it was a response to Angry Birds. And it was placed in Farmville, whatever that is, online, and it was a video game that someone did as a parody.
Is it the cow clicker game?
Yes, exactly. That's exactly what it is. Is it similar in terms of how that?
Yeah, I hadn't thought of putting those two things together, Jude, but that's a really good example of here's someone who is parodying those games that he doesn't like. It's Ian Bogost who did that. Parodying those games he doesn't like by making that game, and he didn't intend it to. He thought people would see it as being stupid, but people got addicted. And it really worked. And he ended up spending more time like dealing with that game than he did teaching his classes.
And people were getting upset, and they, would say, oh no, I mean, that this huge dialogue occurred, and I don't know how many hits that. That's exactly it. Was a cow clicker.
I think one of the differences there is that, I mean, like, there's not the death of the author in that. Like, Bogost is the author. He made that game, and then, like, there is maybe some confusion about what he meant by it, which I guess ties into kind of metaphorical death of the author there. But then he reasserted himself because he stopped it. And he said, I'm ending the game in a month, collect all your cow coins or whatever.
There seems to be some, that's right, there is no real depth of the text, there is not.
There is a text, and in fact, I think he made money from it too.
Yes,
I mean, he ended up being a successful business venture. So.
Yeah.
I'm reading a lot about the current 20-something generation as having really reduced prospects post-graduation, huge student loan debts. A lot of them are living with their parents, delaying marriage. A lot of this in response to the economic system that we've been going through the last 5-10 years. And I'm wondering, is some of this seems to me like people with a lot of time on their hands. To mainstream, is this just a pastime until they get on to something?
Well, I mean, I don't want to call them the fan, self-identified fan in the audience, but I think I think that that's a perception of fans that is kind of persistent, which is why would someone spend so much time writing fan fiction? Why would someone spend time writing videos? Why would someone do this? There's a couple of responses. Yes, some of them probably, this is, like, they don't have that much to do. And I don't want to discount and say that fandom is this remarkable thing that is going to save the world. But I think there are a lot of fans that this is just play for them. In the same way that I might garden or read a book, they're going online and making memes and making videos. And in that sense, it's really good practice for if you are interested in media production, if you are interested in writing. You're putting work out there, it's getting critiqued. All fan fiction kind of gets critiqued by other fans who comment on it. The videos get passed around and talked about in terms of editing techniques. So there is a kind of built-in, citation isn't the right word, reflection of fan work, where you can build skills. And it does lead, it's kind of an affinity space learning, right? It's not formal. You just kind of just play around with these tools and develop your skills playing. So there is a skill development certainly going on here. But I think it's also, I mean, it's fun. I mean, you can work a 9-to-5 job and come home and make a video in a couple of hours and you just kind of share it with people. And it's about sharing. It's about being creative and playing in the way that, when I was younger, I used to make videos with my friends on the weekends, and we would share them and laugh about them and have fun. And I see this as kind of similar, just more public now. Thankfully, those old videos that I made aren't public. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming out.